I'm so upset. I got called in the middle of the paragraph I was reading. Okay. I'm on page 479. I'm gonna finish where I left off. It's only a few pages, so it's okay. It's okay. I got pretty far, and I can't. I got called, and it cut off the video, and I'm so mad. Okay. I'm on the second paragraph. If you have lost place, the sight of former slaves. I'm right there. Okay. The sight of former slaves holding office deeply offended their one-time masters, who lashed out with particular fury at the freedmen's white allies, labeling them scalawags and carpetbaggers. The so-called scalawags were Southerners, often former Unionists and Whigs. The former Confederates accused them, often with wild exaggeration, of plundering the treasuries of the Southern states through their political influence in the radical governments. The carpetbaggers, on the other hand, were supposedly sleazy Northerners who had packed all their worldly goods into a carpetbag suitcase at war's end and had come south to seek personal power and profit. In fact, most were former Union soldiers and Northern businessmen and professionals who wanted to play a role in modernizing the New South. How well or badly did the radical regimes rule? The radical legislators passed much desirable legislation and introduced many sorely needed reforms. For the first time in Southern history, steps were taken toward establishing adequate public schools. Tax systems were streamlined, public works were launched, and property rights were guaranteed to women. Many welcome reforms were retained by the all-white Redeemer governments that later returned to power. Despite these achievements, graft ran rampant in many radical governments. This was especially true in South Carolina and Louisiana, where conscienceless promoters and other pocket patters usually used politically inexperienced blacks as pawns. The worst black and white legislatures purchased as legislative supplies such stationery as hams, perfumes, suspenders, bonnets, corsets, champagne, and a coffin. One thrifty carpetbag governor in a single year saved $100,000 from a salary of $8,000. Yet the sort of corruption was by no means confined to the South in these post-war years. The crimes of the Reconstruction governments were no more outrageous than the scams and felonies being perpetrated in the North at the same time, especially in Boss Tweed's New York. The Ku Klux Klan. I'm out of breath. I don't know why. Okay, the Ku Klux Klan. Deeply embittered, the Southern whites resorted to savage measures against radical rule. Many whites resented the success and ability of black legislators as much as they resented alleged corruption. A number of secret organizations mushroomed forth, the most notorious of which was the Invisible Empire of the South, or the Ku Klux Klan, founded in Tennessee in 1866. Bee-sheeted night riders, their horses' hooves muffled, would approach the cabin of an upstart black and hammer on the door. In ghoulish tones, one thirsty horseman would demand a bucket of water. Then, under pretense of drinking, he would pour it into a rubber attachment concealed beneath his mask and gown, smack his lips, and declare that this was the first water he had tasted since he was killed at the Battle of Shiloh. If fright did not produce the desired effect, force was employed. Such tomfoolery and terror proved partially effective. I died. Okay. Partially effective. Many ex-bondsmen and white carpetbaggers, quick to take a hint, shunned the polls. Those stubborn souls who persisted in their upstart ways were flogged, mutilated, or even murdered. In one Louisiana parish in 1868, whites in 2 days killed or wounded 200 victims. A pile of 25 bodies was found half buried in the woods. By such atrocious practices were blacks kept in their place, that is, down. The Klan became a refuge for numerous bandits and cutthroats. Any scoundrel could don a seat. Congress, outraged by this night-riding lawlessness, passed the Harsh Force Acts of 1870 and 1871. Federal troops were able to stamp out much of the Lash Law, but by this time the Invisible Empire had already done its work of intimidation. Many of the outlawed groups continued their tactics in guise of dancing clubs, missionary societies, and rifle clubs. White resistance undermined attempts to empower blacks politically. The White South for many decades openly flouted the 14th and 15th Amendments. Wholesale disfranchisement of blacks, starting conspicuously about 1890, was achieved by intimidation, fraud, and trickery. Among various underhanded schemes were literacy tests, unfairly administered by whites to the advantage of illiterate whites. In the eyes of white Southerners, the goal of white supremacy fully justified these dishonorable devices. How many more? It's the next. Ooh, 3 more! Yay! Johnson walks the impeachment plank. Radicals, meanwhile, had been sharpening their hatchets for President Johnson. Annoyed by the obstruction of the drunken Taylor in the White House, they falsely accused him of maintaining there a harem of dissolute women. Not content with curbing his authority, they decided to remove him altogether by constitutional processes. As an initial step, Congress in 1867 passed the Tenure of Office Act, as usual over Johnson's veto. Contrary to precedent, the new law required the president to secure the consent of the Senate before he could remove his appointees once they had been approved by that body. One purpose was... Oops. I dropped my microphone. My little microphone. Where was I? One purpose was to freeze into the cabinet the Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, a holdover from the Lincoln administration. Although outwardly loyal to Johnson, he was secretly serving as a spy and informer for the Radicals. Johnson provided the Radicals with a pretext to begin impeachment proceedings when he abruptly dismissed Stanton early in 1868. This House of Representatives immediately vetoed 126-47 to impeach Johnson for high crimes and misdemeanors, as required by the Constitution, charging him with various violations of the Tenure of Office Act. 2 additional articles related to Johnson's verbal assaults on the Congress, involving disgrace, ridicule, hatred, contempt, and reproach. A not guilty verdict for Johnson. Sorry, I've got so much spit in my mouth. With evident zeal, the radical-led Senate now sat as a court to try Johnson on the dubious impeachment charges. The House conducted the prosecution. The trial aroused intense public interest and, with 1,000 tickets printed, proved to be the biggest show of 1868. Johnson kept his dignity and sobriety and maintained a discreet silence. His battery of attorneys argued that the president, convinced that the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional, had fired Stanton merely to put a test case before the Supreme Court. That slow-moving tribunal finally ruled indirectly in Johnson's favor 58 years later. House prosecutors, including oily-tongued Benjamin F. Butler and embittered Thaddeus Stevens, had a harder time building a compelling case for impeachment. On May 16, 1868, the day for the first voting in the Senate, the tension was electric, and heavy breathing could be heard in the galleries. By a margin of only 1 vote, the Radicals failed to muster the 2/3 majority for Johnson's removal. 7 resistant Republican senators, mainly moderates, voted not guilty. Several factors shaped the outcome. Fears of creating a I literally can't read. Oh my god. Let me try that again. Several factors shaped the outcome. Fears of creating a destabilizing precedent played a role, as did principled opposition to using the constitutional mechanism of checks and balances. Political considerations also figured conspicuously. As the vice presidency remained vacant under Johnson, his successor would have been radical Republican Benjamin Wade, the president pro tempore of the Senate. Wade was disliked by many members of the business community for his high tariff, soft money, pro-labor views, and was distrusted by moderate Republicans. Meanwhile, Johnson indicated through his attorney that he would stop obstructing Republican policies in return for remaining in office. Die-hard radicals were infuriated by their failure to muster a 2/3 majority for Johnson's removal. "The country is going to the devil," cried the crippled Stevens as he was carried from the hall, but the nation, though violently aroused, accepted the verdict with a good temper that did credit to its political maturity. In a less stable Republican armed uprising might have erupted against the president. The nation thus thoroughly avoided a dangerous precedent that would have gravely weakened one of the 3 branches of the federal government. Johnson was clearly guilty of bad speeches, bad judgment, and bad temper, but not of high crimes and misdemeanors. From the standpoint of the radicals, his greatest crime had been to stand inflexibly in their path. Whoa! Sorry, I'm looking at that map of the United States and Alaska. It's so big. I didn't know. Holy shit. Okay. The purchase of Alaska. Johnson's administration, though enfeebled at home, achieved its most enduring successes in the field of foreign relations. The Russians, by 1867, were in a mood to sell the vast and chilly expanse of land now known as Alaska. They had already overextended themselves in North America, and they saw that in the likely event of another war with Britain, they probably would lose their defenseless northern province to the sea-dominant British. Alaska, moreover, had been ruthlessly furred out and was a growing economic liability. The Russians were therefore quite eager to unload their frozen asset on the Americans, and they put out seductive feelers in Washington. They preferred the United States to any other purchaser, primarily because they wanted to strengthen the American Republic as a barrier against their ancient enemy, Britain. In 1867, Secretary of State William Seward, an ardent expansionist, signed a treaty with Russia that transferred Alaska to the United States for the bargain price of $7.2 million. Wow. But Seward's enthusiasm for these frigid wastes was not shared by his ignorant or uninformed countrymen, who jeered at Seward's folly. Seward's icebox, Frigidia, and Walrusia. Then why did Congress and the American Republic sanction the purchase? For one thing, Russia alone, among the powers, had been conspicuously friendly to the North during the recent Civil War. Americans did not feel that they could offend their great and good friend, the Tsar, by hurling his walrus-covered icebergs back into his face. Besides, the territory was rumored to be teeming with furs, fish, and gold, and it might yet pan out profitably, as it later did with natural resources, including oil and gas. So Congress and the country accepted Seward's Polar Bear Garden, somewhat derisively, but nevertheless hopefully. Last one, the heritage of Reconstruction. Many white Southerners regarded Reconstruction as a more grievous wound than the war itself. It left a festering scar that would take generations to heal. They resented the upending of their social and racial system, the political empowerment of blacks, and the insult of federal intervention in their local affairs. Yet few rebellions have ended with the victors sitting down to a love feast with the vanquished. Given the explosiveness of the issues that had caused the war and the bitterness of the fighting, the wonder is that Reconstruction was not far harsher than it was. The fact is that Lincoln, Johnson, and most Republicans had no clear picture at war's end of what federal policy toward the South should be. Policymakers groped for the right policies, influenced as much by the Southern responses to defeat and emancipation as by any plans of their own to impose a specific program on the South. The Republicans acted from a mixture of idealism and political expediency. They wanted both to protect the freed slaves and to promote the fortunes of the Republican Party. In the end, their efforts backfired badly. Reconstruction conferred only fleeting benefits on blacks and virtually extinguished the Republican Party in the South for nearly 100 years. Moderate Republicans never fully appreciated the extensive effort necessary to make the freed slaves completely independent citizens, nor the lengths to which Southern whites would go to preserve their system of racial dominance. Had Thaddeus Stevens' radical program of drastic economic reforms and heftier protection of political rights been enacted, things might well have been different. But deep-seated racism, ingrained American resistance to tampering with property rights, and rigid loyalty to the principle of local self-government, combined with spreading indifference in the North to the plight of the blacks, formed too formidable an obstacle. Despite good intentions by Republicans, the Old South was in many ways more resurrected than reconstructed, which spelled continuing woe for generations of Southern blacks. And that was chapter 22. I'm literally still awed by the map of Alaska and the lower 48. I didn't know it was so big. I thought it was like the length of California, maybe? Oh my god, it's huge. Okay. Anyways. Yay! No more reading until after break, but yay!